Hello, Dr. Irwin classmates. This is EDL 851, Module 13, Case Study, A Good Teacher Turns Bad. Of course, as you can tell from the shine off the top of my head, this is Rick Hall. I looked at this case study and I started to build my slides based on what I know. So, according to the case study, Jean Wilson is principal at a rural elementary school. She was a former teacher of 13 years. She has a staff of 18 classroom teachers, some support staff. They work together for 8 years. The school has a very good attendance policy, test scores are high, and the parents are very happy with the situation. The case study is about Mrs. Horton, who's a first grade teacher. She's a former teacher of the year and a very seasoned and capable teacher. After spring break, Principal Wilson noticed that there was a change in Mrs. Horton. Category 1, again, what do I know? Number 5, Mrs. Horton seemed stressed and less friendly. She was very argumentative with other teachers and became upset when they disagreed with her. Principal Wilson did learn that there was a personal situation in Mrs. Horton's life that may be affecting her behavior. Her husband had left, and she was raising her 2 teenage sons on her own. That school year ended, and there was no further incidents. Principal Wilson, of course, was hoping that over the summer break that some of her personal issues would be taken care of that might affect her in the classroom. Again, still in category 1, what do I know? Mrs. Horton, most likely because she was a teacher of the year, spent a lot of time in her classroom preparing for her teaching environment. Principal Wilson was very concerned that her personal issues had not been resolved because she had not been spending a lot more time in her classroom as usual. Crestview was chosen for a new pilot reading program. Mrs. Horton was not on board with that, and she was very argumentative and negative to those who supported it. Principal Wilson started to receive calls and letters from parents who were concerned about what Mrs. Horton was doing in her classroom. Again, category 1, what do I know? Principal Wilson observed her classroom several occasions, but never saw anything out of the norm. The district superintendent was informed that principal that 4 of the parents had contacted him and the school board demanding that their students be removed from Mrs. Horton's classroom. Mrs. Horton was not participating in any kind of teacher conferences, parent-teacher conferences. One day, a gentleman named Mr. Stafford showed up at the school requesting a meeting with Principal Wilson. Principal Wilson set up a conference for the next day between Mrs. Horton and Mr. Stafford. It was obvious from when Mr. Stafford showed up and Mrs. Horton was not prepared for the meeting, and Mr. Stafford became angrier and angrier because he'd left his work that day. The conference did not go well. Mr. Stafford voiced his concerns. Mrs. Horton interjected and called him a liar, and it ended very abruptly with an angry outburst from Mrs. Horton. Principal Wilson apologized to Mr. Stafford and assured him that she would take care of moving his daughter out of Mrs. Horton's classroom. Category 2, identify the problems. As I look at it, Mrs. Horton's personal life was affecting her teaching ability. It's common in people's lives when they have things go wrong that it does affect other areas of their life. Multiple parents were concerned because of the communications to the district office and the school board. Mrs. Horton had obviously insulted Mr. Stafford by calling him a liar. Mrs. Horton did not seem prepared to admit that her personal issues were affecting her classroom behavior. And Mrs. Horton's behavior had severely affected her students. Based on the descriptions from Mr. Stafford and other parents, Mrs. Horton's behavior was really affecting her students. So those are the problems. Category 3, the action plan going forward. Wow. I mean, this is kind of tough for me because it's obvious that Mrs. Horton's personal issues were affecting her teacher, her ability to teach the classroom effectively. So this is a list of action plans that I think I would do as administrator. First of all, I'd set up a private meeting with her at a later time. I would inform the district superintendent of what has happened so far. And in the meeting with Mrs. Horton, I would lay out concerns of the parents and the administration about our classroom behavior. I'd make arrangements to transfer Mr. Stafford's daughter immediately to another class. I would start looking into a long-term sub for Mrs. Horton because it's possible that her personal problems may just need a little bit of time, may need her to sort them out. It's obvious that she's a good teacher when she was teacher of the year. So maybe giving her an opportunity to work those things out and come back into the classroom and be more effective would be the approach. Boy, I'd tell you, I'd look for counseling options for Mrs. Horton. My expertise is not very good in those areas, so I definitely look for help there. I'd meet with my teachers and discuss ways to help her both in the classroom and her personal issues. I feel very tempted to tread lightly on personal problems, but as my responsibility as administrator, I have to take care of the kids in the school. I would increase the classroom observations for Mrs. Horton while she still is in the classroom. And another thing I would do is meet with Mrs. Horton students and parents individually to talk to them to verify that the problems and the issues she's having are legitimate. So that to make sure that I support her. And one of the things I learned in the military is that when you're responsible for people, you take care of them no matter what. So my big key is to do what's best for Mrs. Horton and also what's best for the students. My administrative concerns would be how can I support Mrs. Horton in the classroom when the issues affecting her teaching are personal. That's a fine line to walk. It is my role as administrator to support Mrs. Horton and figure out a way to help her to get back to that Teacher of the Year effectiveness. Another thing I would worry about is piling job security concerns on top of her personal issues could have disastrous results. If she starts worrying about whether she's going to get fired or released or a contract not renewed, that's just going to pile more concerns over on top of her personal issues, and it could just be a train wreck. So I don't want to do that. Bottom line is I have to do what's required to protect my students, but I also have to protect Mrs. Horton as well. So it's a tough nut to crack. I think we've got to figure out what to do, what's best for her, and what's best for the kids as well. And that's the end of my final module in EDL 851. And Dr. Irwin, I certainly appreciate and have enjoyed working with you and hope to work with you again. Thank you.